When I was 11, my dad forbade me from ever entering the tiny, locked room at the end of our upstairs hallway, no exceptions, no explanations. It wasn't just a rule, it was the rule. We could run in the sprinklers in our pajamas or eat cake for breakfast on our birthdays, but that door. Off limits, always. The brass knob was cold and untouched, and I'd feel its chill in my palm every time I dusted it, as if the room itself was reminding me I didn't belong. Dad's face would cloud over if I so much as looked at the door too long. "Don't even think about it," he'd warn, his voice dropping to that low, serious register that made my throat tighten. I remember one summer afternoon, the sun poking through the patterned glass, when I asked, "Why can't I go in there?" He just stared at me for a few seconds, then shook his head. "Some things are just for grown-ups," he said. That was the most I ever got. Still, the room shaped the rhythm of our family life. Every Saturday, Dad would disappear upstairs for an hour. We'd hear the key click, followed by muffled sounds, sometimes a scrape, sometimes a thud, before he came back down, acting like nothing happened. If I lingered in the hallway, he'd wait until I was gone. It was like living with a magician who never revealed his tricks. Dad was mostly a regular dad. He made pancakes with chocolate chips, fixed our bikes, even let us get a cat, despite being allergic. But there were cracks in the facade. Sometimes he'd drift off at the dinner table, staring past us like he was listening to someone else. Other times, he'd rush to hide a notebook or slip a letter into his jacket when the doorbell rang. One night, after I'd asked Mom about the room for the 10th time, she just sighed, running her fingers along the rim of her teacup. "It's nothing for kids," she said, not meeting my eyes. Then, a little too quickly, she changed the subject to my science project. I never saw her go near the locked door herself. If anything, she avoided it more than I did, steering the vacuum away, pretending it was just another part of the wall. Our family photos lined the hallway outside the room: birthdays, graduations, awkward holiday sweaters. But in every picture, if you looked close, Dad's eyes held something unreadable. Sometimes, at night, I'd lie awake listening to the old house creak, wondering what secrets could be big enough to need their own room. Everything changed last week. I was at work, sifting through emails, when my phone buzzed. It was Mom, her voice thin and shaky. "It's your father. He collapsed. They're taking him to the hospital." I barely remember the drive home, just the sound of my heart in my ears, the blur of headlights on wet pavement. The house was different without him. It felt colder, like the absence of his footsteps had sucked the warmth out of the walls. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, drifting through the air as I walked the familiar hallway. Every photo seemed to watch me, silently demanding answers I didn't have. I stood by the locked room, the forbidden door that had defined so much of my childhood. For the first time, there was no one to stop me. I pressed my ear against the wood, half expecting to hear something, anything, but all I heard was my own shaky breath. And then, as I turned to leave, my foot nudged something small and metallic on the floor. A key. Dad's key. Just lying there, as if it had been waiting for me all these years. My hand trembled as I picked it up, the metal warm from the sun. I stared at the door, the weight of a lifetime of questions pressing on my chest. What was Dad hiding? And was I ready to find out? That's when I realized, some doors are locked for a reason. But what happens when you open them anyway? The day after Dad collapsed at work, the house felt like it belonged to someone else. You know how you can walk through the same hallway 1,000 times, but one bad day and suddenly every shadow looks suspicious? That's exactly how it felt when I tiptoed past the kitchen to search his study for insurance documents. The air was heavy with the smell of old paper and the faint, clinical tang of hand sanitizer lingering from Mom's frantic cleaning spree. Every floorboard groaned, as if warning me, "This isn't your space, not really." I rifled through one of Dad's overflowing desk drawers, hands shaking, heart pounding like I was breaking a law. His handwriting, always so precise, glared at me from yellowed envelopes. Receipts, warranties, a faded Polaroid of me and him fishing, clutter, nothing useful. Then, wedged at the back, I found a small, battered tin. I popped it open, expecting coins or maybe a dead AA battery, but nestled inside, surrounded by silky blue ribbon, was a thick, old-fashioned skeleton key. My pulse stuttered. The metal was cold against my palm, but not unfamiliar. I'd seen this key before, dangling from Dad's watch chain when I was a kid. I sat down hard on the floor, cross-legged, the key digging into my palm. I didn't need to ask myself what it was for. There was only one locked door in our house, the one at the end of the upstairs hallway. The forbidden room. The room that, for my whole life, had been off limits, out of bounds, no exceptions. Dad's rule, the only rule he never joked about. I'd spent years making up stories about what was behind it, a treasure chest, a monster, maybe just a dusty pile of taxes. But now, with the key in my hand, all those childish guesses seemed hollow. Part of me wanted to drop the key back in the tin and slam the drawer shut. I could almost hear Dad's voice, stern but tired. "Some doors aren't meant to be opened, kiddo." But another part, louder, older, desperate, needed to know. I stood, the key clenched so tight it left a mark, and padded upstairs. Each step was a drumbeat in my chest. The hallway was dim, just a slant of afternoon sun leaking through the half-closed blinds. The locked room's door loomed at the end, painted the same dull beige as every other door, but somehow more ominous, as if it absorbed all the light. I reached out, touched the cold, pitted doorknob. I hesitated, thumb trembling over the keyhole. Was I about to betray my father, or finally understand him? I pressed my forehead against the door, breathing in the scent of old paint and dust. My hand was slick with sweat. My mind raced. What if I found something I couldn't unsee? What if this was a betrayal? But then I remembered Dad, lying in that hospital bed, pale and suddenly so mortal. If I didn't look now, I might never have another chance. I slid the key into the lock. It caught, then turned with a deep, echoing clunk. The sound sent a shiver through me, like breaking a spell. The door swung open with a reluctant groan. At first, all I saw was darkness. Dust motes danced in the strip of light at my feet. The air inside was cold, stale, and carried a faint scent, like old cologne and cedar, undercut with something sharper, almost chemical. I reached for the switch, fingers groping the wall until I found it. The bulb flickered to life, bathing everything in a sickly yellow glow. My breath caught. The walls were covered in photographs. Hundreds of them, curling with age, pinned in careful, geometric patterns. Some black and white, others faded Polaroids, snapshots of people I didn't recognize, laughing, hugging, mugging for the camera in parks, at parties, at what looked like a small-town parade. In the center of the back wall was a large, framed portrait of a woman with a gentle smile and dark, kind eyes. Below the photographs, shelves sagged under the weight of strange memorabilia, a battered baseball glove, a ceramic horse, stacks of yellowed playbills from off-Broadway theaters. There were boxes everywhere, neat, labeled in Dad's blocky handwriting. But the names weren't his. M. Turner, J. Langley, D. Evans. I froze, staring at one box labeled, 4S. I reached out, running my fingers over the dusty lid. The cardboard was soft, almost velvety, like it hadn't been touched in years. I felt like an intruder in a museum curated by someone I thought I knew. A sudden chill ran down my spine. Dad? I whispered, even though I knew he wasn't there. My voice barely stirred the silence. I pulled the 4S box off the shelf and sat cross-legged in the narrow patch of sunlight near the door. The cardboard creaked as I lifted the lid. Inside, I found envelopes tied with twine, a stack of journals with cracked leather covers, and a handful of objects that made no sense. A pressed flower, a tiny keychain shaped like a piano, a faded train ticket from a town I'd never heard of. I picked up one of the journals, hands shaking. The first page was addressed to Sarah. I frowned. Who was Sarah? The handwriting was Dad's, but looser, more hurried than I'd ever seen. I flipped through the pages, scanning snippets. Stories of late-night walks, inside jokes, trips to the movies. There were mentions of someone named Daniel, of holiday dinners I'd never attended, of a dog called Lucky. It read like a parallel life, a secret history running right alongside the one I'd always known. One envelope was heavier than the others. I untied the twine and slid out a stack of letters, each addressed to Sarah Turner. The return address was for a P.O. box I didn't recognize. The postmark was from nearly 20 years ago. I ran my thumb over a date, April 15, 2004. That was the year after I was born. I scanned the first lines. Dear Sarah, I hope you're well. I think of you every day. The rest blurred as my mind raced. Was Sarah a lost friend? A sister I'd never met? Or something else? I set the letters aside and rifled through the memorabilia. A theater program with Break a Leg, Love Dad, scrawled in the margin. A school photo of a girl with long brown hair and Dad's eyes. My heart thudded. Was this my sister? The air in the room seemed to crackle, suddenly electric. I tried to piece it together, but every new detail just made the picture stranger. Why had Dad hidden all this? Why the secrecy? Why the locked door and the rules? I couldn't sit with those questions alone. I pulled out my phone and dialed Mom. She answered on the second ring, her voice brittle and tired. Hey, honey, are you at the hospital? No, I'm home, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mom, I found the key. I went into the room. There was a long silence, then a shaky sigh. I wondered when you'd find that. I'm sorry we never told you about it. Your father, he always thought it was safer that way. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, my palm sweaty. Mom, who's Sarah Turner? Why are there all these pictures and letters? Mom's breath caught. For a moment I thought she might hang up. Then, finally, she spoke. Sarah was someone very important to your dad. Before you were born, before we even met, he had a different life. There was a lot of pain. Some things he never got over, but he never wanted you to carry that burden. I heard the clatter of dishes in the background, the muffled sound of the hospital intercom. Did you know about all this? I asked. I knew some, she said quietly. Not everything. There were things he kept to himself, things I only learned after we married. I always hoped he'd tell you himself one day. Maybe he was waiting for the right time, or maybe he was afraid. I stared at the portrait on the far wall, the woman with the gentle smile. Who is she? I asked. Mom hesitated, her voice barely more than a whisper. That's Sarah's mother. She died when Sarah was very young. Your dad tried to take care of her, but it was complicated. He lost touch with Sarah after a while. He always blamed himself. I sank back against the wall, the phone pressed to my cheek, the dust thick in my throat. So I have a sister? There was a long pause. You had a sister, Mom said. But she passed away a long time ago. Your father never really recovered. That room, it was his way of keeping her memory alive. He just couldn't let go. I closed my eyes, the weight of the secret pressing in. The smell of cedar and old paper felt suffocating now. All those years I'd tiptoed around the locked door, imagining monsters, and the real truth was so much sadder than anything I'd ever imagined. I hung up, tears stinging my eyes, and looked around at the scraps of a life I never knew existed. I pulled another box down, this one heavier, labeled J. Langley. Inside were more letters, more photographs, but these ones showed Dad, my dad, smiling with a group of people around a campfire, a guitar in his lap. On the back of one photo was a note, Summer, 97, the best days. I realized, slowly, that these weren't just mementos, they were proof of an entire, hidden chapter of my father's life. I pieced it together, bit by bit. The room wasn't just about a secret hobby or a lost friend. It was a memorial, a gallery of grief and memory, a place where my father kept his old self alive. The names on the boxes, Turner, Langley, Evans, were all people he'd loved and lost before I was ever born. Suddenly, I understood why Dad had locked that room. It wasn't about keeping me out. It was about keeping the past contained, somewhere safe, where it couldn't bleed into the present. But now, with him in the hospital and the key in my hand, the past was loose, and it was up to me to decide what to do with it. I reached for one last box, the smallest of them all, taped shut and labeled only with my name. My heart hammered as I peeled back the tape, wondering what other secrets Dad had left for me, and what they'd mean for both of us, now that the door was finally open. The next morning, I walked into the hospital with the weight of the little iron key pressing against my ribs. The air inside was sterile and cold, but my palms were clammy. Dad looked small in the bed, sunlight catching the stubble on his jaw. For a moment, I just watched his chest rise and fall, wondering how to even start this conversation. Finally, I sat down and placed the key on the white bedsheet between us. I went into the room. Dad, I said, voice barely above a whisper. The words hung there, suspended in the hum of the machines and the distant hallway chatter. He closed his eyes, and for a second, I thought he might pretend to sleep. But then he sighed, a sound that seemed to shake the whole bed. You always were too curious for your own good, he said, trying for a smile. It didn't quite land. I told him what I found, the photos, the letters, the other family, his other life. My throat felt tight, but I forced out every detail, even the part where I'd sat on the floor and cried. The steady beep of his heart monitor filled the silence between my sentences. Dad reached for my hand, his skin dry and papery. I never wanted to hurt you or your mom, he said. Back then, I thought I could keep everything separate, protect everyone. But secrets, they don't stay put. He started talking, really talking, in a way I'd never heard before. He told me about falling in love with someone else after my mom, about the guilt and shame, about the endless juggling of holidays, weekends, lies. His voice cracked as he explained how he'd tried to end things, but always got pulled back by promises and regrets. I asked him, did you ever want to tell us? He nodded, eyes shining. Every day, he said. But the longer it went, the harder it got. I was scared I'd lose you both. For a long minute, I just listened to the whir of the hospital ventilator and the distant rattle of a meal cart in the hall. I realized I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Later that week, after Dad's surgery, Mom and I sat together on the porch. The air was thick with the smell of cut grass and something sweeter, maybe honeysuckle. She was quieter than usual, her gaze fixed on the hydrangeas. I always wondered about that room, she said quietly, but I was afraid of what I'd find. We talked for hours, about trust, about the lies that pile up when people are scared, about how forgiveness isn't a one-time thing. There were tears, but also a strange, fragile kind of hope. I noticed that Mom squeezed my hand a little tighter when she spoke about starting over. Dad came home 2 weeks later. He was slower, thinner, but when he walked up the stairs, he paused outside the room. He looked at me, question in his eyes. It's okay, I said. Let's keep it open. We cleared out the old boxes together. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, and the room felt bigger than I remembered. We didn't throw everything away. Some things, like the letters, we agreed to keep, as a reminder. Now, when I pass the once locked door, it stands wide open. It's just a room, but it's also a promise that secrets, no matter how heavy, are easier to carry when you share them. And that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to move forward, door unlocked, into whatever comes next.